Whether it's for a loan, a new job, or even your insurance premium, more and more of these huge economic decisions that shape our lives aren't being made by a person anymore. They're being made by an algorithm. Now, these systems promise to be super efficient and objective, right? But what happens when the code itself has a hidden bias? Okay, let's get into it.
So this whole issue just blew up back in 2019, all because of one viral tweet. A tech entrepreneur named David Heinemeier Hansen was, let's just say, not happy. The brand new Apple Card, which was backed by Goldman Sachs, offered him a credit limit that was 20 times, that's 20 times higher than his wife's. And that one tweet, it kicked off a massive firestorm and even a formal investigation. And here's the part that really got people outraged. His wife actually had a better credit score. So what was going on? And this wasn't just a one-off thing either. Apple's own co-founder, Steve Wozniak, came forward and said the exact same thing happened to him. He got 10 times the credit his wife did. This was a huge red flag that something was seriously broken inside that algorithm's black box. That story is the perfect entry point into a much, much bigger shift happening in our economy. We've really entered an era where our financial lives are being judged not by people, but by these complex, automated systems.
The official term for these is Algorithmic Decision-Making Systems, or ADS. You can kind of think of them as the new invisible architects of economic opportunity. They're churning through mountains of data to make predictions and decisions at a speed and scale that no team of humans could ever possibly handle.
Now, Goldman Sachs, the bank behind the Apple Card, immediately insisted their algorithm was gender blind. They said it didn't even use gender as a piece of data. And, the investigation didn't find any proof they were intentionally discriminating. But the outcome was clearly unequal. So that begs the really big question. If you tell the machine not to look at gender, how on earth does a bias like this still happen? Well, to get that, we have to pull back the curtain and look at the sneaky ways bias can infect artificial intelligence. And it usually happens in one of three main ways. First up, there's historical bias. This is pretty straightforward. If you train an AI on decades of old lending data, it's going to learn all the discriminatory patterns from that time, like redlining, and just keep doing them. Then you have representation bias. This happens when the data you use to train the model just doesn't include everybody, which means it'll be less accurate for those underrepresented groups. And finally, there's the really subtle one, algorithmic bias, which you might hear called the proxy problem.
And let's just take a second to talk about the scale of that representation issue. In the US alone, there are 26 million adults who are credit invisible. That means they just don't have a file with the big credit bureaus. These are disproportionately people from Black, Hispanic, and low-income communities. And when you're not in the data, to the AI, you basically don't exist. You're locked out of the system before you even start. So that brings us to this proxy problem. It's fascinating, really. Even if you scrub all the protected data, like race or gender, from your dataset, other seemingly neutral data points can act as stand-ins or proxies. For example, because of a long history of housing segregation, a person's zip code can be a really strong predictor of their race. So an algorithm that uses zip code to figure out risk can end up discriminating by race, without ever knowing a person's race. And this is where it starts to get wild and, honestly, a little bizarre. Research has found that algorithms might use all of these factors to judge you. Get this, are you an iPhone or an Android user? Apparently, iPhone users are less likely to default. Use an older email provider like Yahoo? That could be a bad sign to an algorithm. Even something as small as typing in all lowercase has been correlated with a higher risk. Your digital exhaust is becoming this sort of invisible shadow credit score.
So this all leads to this massive challenge, right? If the bias is so deeply buried inside these layers of proxies and historical data, how can anyone, developers, regulators, possibly find and fix a problem that they can't even easily see or measure?
Well, it turns out we're not flying completely blind. The field of AI ethics has been developing some pretty rigorous mathematical tools that are designed specifically to audit these algorithms for fairness. Let's take a quick look at how that actually works.
Two of the most common ways to measure fairness are called demographic parity and equalized odds. Let's break those down real quick. Demographic parity is all about equal outcomes. It asks a really simple question. Is every group, say men and women, getting approved for a loan at the same rate? That's it. Equalized odds, on the other hand, is focused on equal accuracy. It asks something different. Is the model making mistakes at the same rate for all groups? In other words, is it equally good or equally bad at predicting for everyone?
And I want to be clear, this is not just some academic debate. The choice of which metric you use has life and death consequences.
Take the compass algorithm, which was used in the U.S. justice system to predict if someone was likely to reoffend. It became this huge flashpoint for controversy because it was shown to have a much higher false positive rate for black defendants than for white ones. The creators argued it was fair by a different metric. It just goes to show that sometimes making an algorithm fair by one definition can actually make it unfair by another.
But okay, even if you pick the right way to measure fairness, you run into another huge hurdle. You still need to be able to look inside the algorithm to understand why it's making its decisions. And with a lot of the most advanced AI models today, that is incredibly hard to do.
This is where this huge push for transparency comes from. It's a whole field of study now, and it's called, fittingly, explainable AI.
And this is a perfect illustration of how it works. There are these tools, like one called Lime, that can basically peek inside the AI's brain. For any single prediction it makes, like this simple one, a flu diagnosis, it can highlight which inputs were the most important. So here you can see that sneeze and headache strongly pointed toward a flu diagnosis, but no fatigue pushed against it. It takes a process that's totally opaque and makes it understandable to a regular person. But here's the thing. Even with all these clever technical fixes, like fairness metrics and explainable AI, that's still only part of the solution. If we really want to build responsible AI, we need a much bigger approach, one that includes our legal system and, maybe most importantly, actual human judgment.
So what does a complete framework for building AI responsibly even look like? Well, it really boils down to 3 essential pillars.
First, you have to use the technical tools we've been talking about, audit your algorithms constantly, and demand transparency. Second, you have to have strong legal frameworks. Laws like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act basically say that discriminatory outcomes are illegal, regardless of your intent. Regulators are making it very clear that the algorithm did it is just not going to fly as an excuse. And third, you have to have real human oversight. We're talking about independent audits, internal ethics boards, and making sure there's always a human in the loop who can review and override a critical automated decision.
Because at the end of the day, and this quote from legal scholars Lillian Edwards and Michael Vail just nails it, transparency isn't the same thing as accountability. It's not enough to just see how a bad decision was made. Accountability means someone has to actually stand up, justify that decision, and face real, meaningful consequences if it was unfair or caused harm.
All right, so let's just quickly recap the big ideas here. First, AI can absolutely pour gasoline on the fire of existing societal inequalities if we let it run wild. Second, that bias gets in there through the data, both from our biased history and from those sneaky little proxy variables. But, and this is the hopeful part, we can fight back. We have a growing toolkit of fairness metrics, transparency tools, legal accountability, and good old-fashioned human oversight. The ultimate goal here has to be engineering AI that actually serves people and makes society more fair, not just one that maximizes profits.
Which really leaves us with one last massive question to think about. The algorithms we're building today are like a mirror. They learn from the data we feed them. They reflect our past decisions, our societal structures, all our hidden biases. So as we design the automated future, we really have to ask ourselves, what values are we programming into the code? What kind of future are we choosing to teach them?